everyone. I'm Katie Moore. I'm the CEO of the Virginia Funders Network, and we are so glad that everyone's joined us today. We have a really exciting topic for you. VFN has just released its second publication, and we're going to be exploring that, as well as having a great lineup of panelists to talk a little bit about policy and advocacy and the power that it has for philanthropy. As a newly established membership association composed of over 100 grant-making organizations investing in the Commonwealth, VFN's working to build a connected, collaborative, philanthropic community that advances opportunities for all Virginians. And this year, we've approached our work in three primary ways. We've worked to build a solid foundation for our organization. We've established the leadership and governance structure, the policies and procedures, the communications tools and infrastructure that we need to operate efficiently and effectively for many years to come. And I'd like to give a big thanks to our 18-member board of advisors who have been instrumental in the establishment of this new organization. They've done yeoman's work this year as we've launched from scratch and built this organization over the last year. The second bucket of work that we've focused on this year is fostering a vibrant network. More than 100 funders from every region of the Commonwealth have joined the network. And to help you connect and learn with each other, we've hosted more than 20 networking and learning events. We've helped you connect and learn from each other and from experts. And big thanks to our networking group co-chairs who've been really instrumental in helping us plan and execute these many gatherings. And the third bucket is really around leveraging the power of the network. With more than 100 of Virginia's top philanthropy organizations in our network, we're really excited about the possibility of what we can achieve together. The work you're going to hear about on today's call, the work that led to the publication of our new policy and advocacy publication, is part of this bucket of work, as was our work focused on helping funders understand and capitalize on the American Rescue Plan's $7 billion investment in Virginia. This year, we've hosted 7 legislative briefings. We've released 2 publications, and we've started exploring how Virginia or how VFN could support members with their collective and individual efforts to improve quality of life across the state. But none of this work would have been possible without my wonderful colleague, Robin Mockenhaupt. She's VFN's Director of Policy and Advocacy. It also would not have been possible without the support of the Richmond Memorial Health Foundation and PATH Foundation, who generously underwrote VFN's policy and advocacy work this year. Many of you know Robin from her nearly 2 decades at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where she most recently served as the SVP for Strategic Initiatives and leader of the foundation's policy unit. Others of you may know her from her time as a member and board member of Grantmakers in Health. She also served as the chair of Grantmakers in Health's board. Robin also spent more than 15 years with AARP, and she co-authored a book on healthy aging and is a nationally known philanthropic leader in population health. VFN is so lucky to have her as our first ever Director of Policy and Advocacy, and I'm personally and professionally privileged to have gotten to know her and work with her over the last year. Robin, we're excited about today's session, and I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Katie, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for joining today. I'm really looking forward to this publication briefing on policy and advocacy and a terrific panel discussion with some leaders around the state who are engaged in using these strategies and tools. But let me just also start by saying how delighted I am to be part of the staff and involved in the leadership of Virginia Funders Network. It's a wonderful opportunity for philanthropy in New Jersey. That's where I used to live, in Virginia, and I'm delighted to be part of it. This is my home back in Virginia again, and I'm really pleased to be here. So let me start by introducing the panel. We have, as I mentioned, some great leaders from around the state. And I'm going to start by pulling up my slides so that you can see them. I hope you can see them now on your screen. So Natisha Knight is the Director of Community Partnerships with the Community Foundation for a Greater Richmond. Natisha plays a really important role in moving the Community Foundation's desire to create systems level change for Central Virginia residents. She partners and collaborates with the government agencies, elected and appointed officials, public entities, corporations, private institutions, nonprofits, and other funders to envision, develop, and execute solutions designed to address systemic issues that contribute to inequities. Her primary focus at the Community Foundation is education, workforce development, and housing. Natisha also works with the rest of the team at the Community Foundation to advance the broader foundation's work and vision. So Natisha, welcome, and thank you so much for being part of this panel today. Next, I'd like to introduce Heather Peeler, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of ACT for Alexandria. Heather previously worked at Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, which is where I actually first met Heather, which is an organization dedicated to effective philanthropy and nonprofit success. She was Vice President of Member and Partner Engagement, and she mobilized a national network of more than 5,000 grant makers in adopting practices to make the greatest impact on nonprofit performance. She also served as Chief Strategy Officer at the Corporation for National and Community Service and as Managing Director at Community Wealth Partners. Throughout her career, Heather has focused on bringing people together to make their organizations and their communities stronger. She regularly writes and speaks about capacity building, community engagement, collaboration, and learning and evaluation. So Heather, thanks again for being part of this panel today. And finally, Carol Sale, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Williamsburg Health Foundation. Previously, Carol served as the Executive Director of Lackey Clinic in York County from 2012 to 2018. She has over 35 years of healthcare management experience, including work as a Corporate Director of Patient Safety for the Centera Healthcare System, a national consultant on quality improvement and patient safety with Healthcare Concepts in Austin, Texas. And prior to that was the Regional Director of Risk Management for the Bon Secours Health System, covering New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Carol has managed teams of professionals at Centera Health, Riverside Health System, and Bon Secours Health System. She also is a frequent speaker on healthcare and wellness and understands the importance of strategic management, financial affairs, and data oversight. So Carol, again, thanks so much for being part of this panel. I feel honored to have all of you involved in the conversation this afternoon. So as I mentioned, this is an overview and presentations of a recent publication that Virginia Funders Network released just last Tuesday. I'm going to talk a little bit about that and share the findings and the results of conversations that I heard over the last 6 months of working with many organizations and individuals in the state who are interested in a variety of issues of importance in Virginia, and with people outside the Commonwealth who care about what happens in Virginia. So I want to just start by thanking those of you who are on the call today who spoke with me during the course of developing this publication. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your thoughts and any input that you had on the preparation of this publication. And of course, I'm going to put in a plug for all of you if you haven't had the opportunity to take a look at it to do so. And it's on the Virginia Funders Network website. So let's just jump in. And here's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about how the document was created. I'm going to tell you about the 5 main findings that I heard through the many discussions I had, and then end with some resources and a summary of thoughts about what I heard. So let's start with the background. This publication really seeks to answer 3 questions. What does the policy and advocacy landscape currently look like in Virginia? What are strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? Why, when, and how do funders engage in policy and advocacy in the state? And what impact do they hope to have with using these tools? And then third, how can Virginia Funders Network support members and funders in Virginia to engage in policy and advocacy activities? As all of you know on this call, Virginia funders' interests are incredibly diverse. There's a wide range of funders who vary in terms of shape and type and funding priorities. So this document is not a list of policies that every funder should care about, but what it is really a collection of advice and recommendations that I heard from all of you who I spoke with and many others around the state about how they use policy and advocacy tools and strategies and their recommendations for Virginia Funders Network about how to best serve members. So let me tell you a little bit about the methodology that I used. I spoke with 80 different organizations and about 100 individuals total. And I interviewed them primarily through Zoom between the period of April and August of this year. And the kinds of organizations that I interviewed were business, governmental, and nonprofit associations, funders, government affairs and government relations organizations, philanthropy serving organizations like VFN, but often focused on a particular issue area, and a number of policy and advocacy organizations within the state. And I thought I would just comment for a minute about this particular time period when I had these conversations and the environment in which these conversations happened. As you all know, everyone is dealing with coronavirus, the pandemic, and its impact on our health and financial well-being as individuals, as organizations, as leaders, as the state, as the country, as the world. And that certainly was a theme that came up in the conversation. The impacts of social change last year and this year's protests, awareness of the impacts of racism, and how to focus on opportunities for all Virginians also was a theme that came up in virtually every conversation. Political polarization and how to bring people together around policy and advocacy came up. And of course, fall elections coming up in Virginia just next week. So I just thought I'd paint a little bit of a picture, which I know you already know, about sort of the backdrop of what happened during some of these conversations. So let's just start with a few definitions of how I was defining public policy and advocacy. And I do want to say that the focus of the publication is on public policy. So it's what principles, laws, and plans and actions that governmental entities take at the federal, state, and local level, and what they choose to do or not do. So, of course, examples of policy might be, should we fund pre-K in our area, in our state, in our country? Should our community have affordable housing options? Should Virginia Medicaid cover dental benefits, which of course, thrillingly, it now does. Advocacy is what the public or what we as organizations or individuals do to support particular causes or policy. So advocacy is really making the case for your cause or your mission. An example in a community might be community members who gather together and organize a campaign to advocate for lighting in a public park to make the neighborhood safer for all residents. So that's an example of taking action on to create or implement a public policy. So let's, without further ado, hear about the 5 main findings that I heard in these conversations, which are also detailed in the publication. And I just want to mention that there are a number of vignettes through the publications, which are funders and policy and advocacy organizations talking about their stories and their experience. And I encourage all of you to read those stories because they're very rich and compelling. So the first finding is that policy and advocacy are powerful tools for funders who want to have greater impact. You know, funders realize that these tools and these strategies are really part of what it is that they hope to accomplish, how they hope to reach their mission. And among the tools they use to use their influence as an organization. Some funders are using strategies and are quite explicit about it in strategic plans that they might have developed for their organizations. Others fly a little bit under the radar in the state, and maybe they don't use the words policy and advocacy, but they talk about how they're having influence as an organization. So the first finding that I heard from everyone really was what powerful tools these can be for funders who want to have impact. And here are some of the recommendations I heard from people I spoke with. To start by assessing your readiness, your interest, and your capacity of leadership and staff. And think about at the governance, at the executive level, at the staff level, what are the skill sets you need, and develop or acquire those over time. Secondly, listen to grantees, listen to partners, listen to community members and stakeholders to understand what the most pressing community issues are, and then which ones should be and can be addressed through policy change or advocacy action. Third, to start small. Every funder, no matter who you are, whether you're a public funder or private funder, you can get involved in policy and advocacy in some way. So start small, experiment, and learn as an organization. And then finally, many, as I mentioned, funders have built policy and advocacy into strategic plans. So it is a part of their mission and what they hope to accomplish, among other strategies. So that's the first finding. The second finding was that many funders talked about that being involved in policy and advocacy really helped them increase equity and opportunity in the communities and the populations that they cared about, that they worked with, and that those communities and populations had been historically marginalized or excluded from decision-making and from resources. So many funders talked about the importance of focusing on different populations and communities and using policy and advocacy tools to help build empowerment, build voice, and build engagement. So some of the recommendations that came up in this is to start your involvement in policy and advocacy with an equity lens. Start from the very beginning and thinking about how can this policy change or my actions create a more equitable outcome for the communities or the populations that I care about. Starting with that frame at the beginning helped lead towards effective planning and implementation of plans. Secondly, to pay close attention to who your audience was and the language that resonates with them. Some funders talked about testing what words resonated best with the populations that they served and cared about, and use particular language in their community to address equity and opportunity that they care about. And then third, be willing to have honest conversations. One person that I spoke with said, you know, this is not for the weak of heart, getting involved in policy and advocacy, but everyone can do it. There were often honest and sometimes difficult conversations that were required with staff, with board members, with communities, and with stakeholders in the community to talk about equity and the important role that that played in increasing opportunity. The third finding is about organizational capacity investment in Virginia and how to ensure a diverse and thriving policy and advocacy community. Many funders and policy organizations themselves talked about that there has been a growth over the last many years in the size, the scope, and the depth of the infrastructure of policy and advocacy organizations in this state. That decades ago, maybe there were just a handful of organizations, and today there are many more who work on a variety of issue areas that Virginia funders care about. So it's clear that the organizations have matured and there are more of them in the state than a decade ago. But it also was very clear that those organizations are not spread evenly across the Commonwealth. So one of the recommendations that I heard from conversations I had was to take a look at where the organizational capacity is of policy and advocacy organizations. They often tend to cluster in some of the larger cities and the suburbs of the larger cities. And there are some areas of the Commonwealth that really are not served by the infrastructure of policy and advocacy organizations. So think about that as a funder, how to expand some of that capacity to other parts of the state. Secondly, to think about the advocacy infrastructure, not only at the state level or at the city level, but also at the community and neighborhood level. And to think about the grassroots and how advocates themselves are engaged in the process and participate in advocacy activities. Third, for funders to provide multi-year flexible funding and general operating support and unrestricted funding that often allowed policy and advocacy organizations to build the capacity that they needed. We're pleased to have program funding as well, but it was really the multi-year flexible general operating support that allowed them to build needed capacities across the board. And then finally, to provide communication support and training and bring advocates together and policy groups together to, again, support their capacity. The fourth finding was about building strategic partnerships, both across sectors, government, nonprofit, and the business community, as well as across issues, so that there can be an opportunity for more collective impact across sectors. It's really clear that an investment in a spectrum of different policy and advocacy expertise across sectors is really critical, and that no one sector has the resources necessary to deal with some of the issues and the problems that we care about and try to address in our various organizations. So it's really important for funders to develop those partnerships with other types of organizations and with other strategic partners like elected and appointed officials, government agencies, advocacy groups, the business community, universities, etc. So some of the recommendations that came out from this were to really understand the external environment and the policy context in which you and partners work and what is important to you, and to really know your audience when you begin strategic partnerships and relationships with other groups. Second, to understand both what your priorities are, but also what the top priorities are for other partners that you might get engaged with, and to be strategic, to choose those partners where you can share a common vision together or work on particular issues together. Many people talked about the important convening influence that funders have and how they can bring together various community partners and partners in a strategic manner to talk about policy and advocacy work. Even if the funder doesn't get deeply engaged in funding those activities, the mere fact of convening them and allowing policy conversations to happen across sectors and issues was considered to be a really important role. And then finally, for funders to think about, identify, and create opportunities for pooled funding. Look for ways that a group of funders could work together on a particular issue and could braid or blend streams of different funding, including with other sectors like government and corporations. The last finding that I heard was about the role of Virginia Funders Network and how it can really play a role in helping members use policy and advocacy to advance opportunities for all Virginians. And as a philanthropy serving organization in the state, that's what Virginia Funders Network is interested in doing. And some of the recommendations I heard from conversations were, let's provide education for members about policy and advocacy. What can funders do? What legally are they allowed to do? What's possible? What are the needs? And what policies might they get engaged with? How to best support grantees and advocacy organizations and others to advocate for themselves. Virginia Funders Network could share best practices and facilitate relationships across the state, connecting different groups with each other and sharing best practices from one part of the state to another part of the state. It was suggested that we, the Funders Network, continue to provide annual General Assembly updates. This during our inaugural year. This year, there was a pre and post General Assembly update, and I'll put in a plug now for January 6th of 2022, when we're already scheduled to have the 2022 pre-General Assembly update. So we hope to do that annually to provide everyone an update on what's happening at the state legislative level. Finally, there was a call for the funding network to help identify opportunities for engagement around the state, to connect with each other, other funders with each other, but opportunities for engagement with different sectors. So those were the 5 findings. This is a summary. It's in the publication. I am not going to go into it in detail, but I did a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats chart for funders. I would just lift up a couple of thoughts. One is that the use of policy and advocacy by Virginia funders has grown over the past decade, and Virginia has an increasingly connected, growing policy and advocacy community. Unfortunately, advocacy is still a hard sell among some in the funding community. But there are lots of opportunities of ways that funders can focus on giving voice to community residents, to neighbors, to policy and advocacy organizations, even in spite of some of the threats of political polarization and crises that we're dealing with. So I think there are a lot of opportunities in the state, and was pleased to have had the opportunity to hear from many of you about what those opportunities are. One of the things that I really loved hearing from my various conversation was the continuum of types of strategies that funders in the state use, from very sort of first steps, beginning phases of thinking about increasing awareness and getting involved in local communities and public task forces or commissions on topics of interest to funders, all the way through funding policy research and analysis, to convening stakeholders and decision makers about policy and advocacy, to funding those organizations and advocating for change via using your voice as a funder in a variety of ways. So there really is a continuum of different strategies and tools that every funder can use. And it was inspiring to me to hear about those stories during the conversations I had. So let me just sum up by talking a little bit about some of the resources that are available. And you'll find these in the back of the publication. There are many, many national, regional, and state organizations that have resources for any funder who's interested in getting involved. These are some of them that I've displayed on the slide. Many of them have online resources and publications, which I use quite a bit in the work that I do. And there are many policy and advocacy organizations in Virginia who have amazing written and technical assistance resources for funders and for others in the state. So I'd encourage you to take a look, especially at that last section of the publication. So what I'd love to leave you with is that funders of all shapes and sizes can be involved legally in being active in policy and advocacy. And I'll end with a quote from a famous Virginian, Arthur Ashe: "Start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can." With the growth of the policy and advocacy infrastructure and network in Virginia, with the interest of Virginia funders and more funders getting involved in policy and advocacy, it's a great time to get involved and to learn from each other about what is possible and what can be done. I hope this publication is a great resource for all of you, and I look forward to learning from you in the next discussion. And into the future, I'm happy to talk with any of you that I might be able to help in any way and learn from what you're doing. So with that, why don't we just see if there are any quick questions right now that we can answer, and then we'll turn to the panel in just a minute. But let me stop and see if there are any questions. I should mention, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so in the chat function. So please feel free to enter any questions that you might have. I'll tell you what, I'll let you all continue thinking about those questions and move on to the panel. So as I mentioned, let me just go the right direction with these slides. There we go. We have a great set of panelists to talk about their work in Virginia. And so I'm going to stop sharing slides, and we'll ask them to talk a little bit about their work. So first of all, again, Natisha, Carol, Heather, thank you so much for being part of this today. I'd love for each of you to talk a little bit about how you started thinking about getting involved in policy and advocacy in your organization. What was happening in the external environment or in your organization that led you to start thinking about this? And what did you take into account as you started contemplating this work? So Natisha, can I ask you to start and share a little bit about how you thought about this at the Community Foundation?
Sure. So I actually joined the foundation in late December of 2020 as the Director of Community Partnerships, with a focus on advocacy, policy, and systems level work for the organization. And it was the culmination of a long process within the organization to come to this place where they felt like focusing on advocacy and policy was something that they wanted to include in their strategy. And that came about because of the desire to see long-term changes to some of the issues that we're seeing in our region. And the Community Foundation recognized that continuing to fund direct service organizations was going to be beneficial in the short term, but in the long term, in order to see some of these long-standing disparities that are in the region, we needed to focus on policy and advocacy. And so that's what I was brought on board to do. And using all of the skills and tools and strategies available to me to do that. And so we like to say here at the foundation that I focus on little a advocacy and not the big A advocacy. And so I do a lot of what you mentioned in your report as far as convening thought leaders around different issues, bringing together collaborators to talk about different issues, and then also educating leaders within the community as far as what they can do through their nonprofit to engage their community members in elevating their voice and ensuring that we can see some policy changes and system level changes in our region.
Great, thank you so much, Natisha. Heather, how about you? How did you first start thinking about this, and what did you keep in mind as you were getting engaged?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And Robin, thank you so much for including me on the panel. Really looking forward to our discussion. So Act for Alexandria is a community foundation that serves the city of Alexandria in Virginia, and it's a community of about 160,000 people. And so I like to say we're hyper local in that we focus exclusively on the city of Alexandria. And historically, we were not an advocacy funder. We were a fairly traditional community foundation that responded to the interests of our donor advised fund holders. And we had a small discretionary pool of funding, which we used for capacity building grants. It's a traditional capacity building around strategic planning, financial management, and so on. And so it was, I guess in 2019, I attended a funder briefing on the 2020 census. And that's what helped me become familiar with some of the urgency and issues around community engagement with the census. And that led us as an organization to think about our role and what we could do in the city of Alexandria. So I would say our foray into advocacy really began with a focus on civic engagement and mobilization, and thinking about ways we can tap into the strengths of our community in terms of our nonprofit grantee and community partners who have the trusted relationships with residents, how we can support them in being ambassadors, spreading the word, and mobilizing the community around the census. We also joined the City of Alexandria's Complete Count Committee, which was focused on the census. So that was also one of our first efforts into becoming part of a public commission. And we also made some mini grants available to our community partners to do that advocacy and outreach to the community around the census. So that's really what led us into the work. And it was really driven by the fact that we knew, or historically, communities of color, BIPOC communities have been underrepresented when it comes to the census. And so we wanted to make sure that everyone in Alexandria was counted. And in fact, the 2020 census registered a 30% increase in the Latino population in Alexandria. So we're really excited that we played a role in ensuring that that all residents had their voices heard and were counted in the census.
Great, thanks so much, Heather. Carol, what did you start thinking about as you joined Williamsburg Health Foundation as a new CEO?
Well, thank you, Robin. I also really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the discussion today. And like Heather, we are a hyper-local foundation. We're a health legacy foundation. And so a lot of our work is focused on both upstream and downstream issues related to improving the health of our community. The foundation really began, I think, back in their 2015 through 17 strategic plan to include a focus on a health in all policies, which was a framework developed by the World Health Organization. And based on research that the foundation funded, we used that work and the health in all policies framework to guide decisions that could allow us to be thoughtful and data driven. We wanted to focus on advocacy for health opportunities, which aim to capitalize on the social, moral, intellectual, and reputational capital of the foundation. And we wanted our work to add our work from giving fish to really opportunities to teach organizations how to fish, to make sure that the pond was well stocked, that the poles were in good working order. And doesn't do anyone any good to teach them how to fish. It's kind of useless if the pond is empty. So we wanted to make sure that that was available. And that the world was shifting at that point in time. Health legacy foundations in the wake of the Affordable Care Act were really beginning to look at, would funding direct basic healthcare services for the uninsured continue to be at that level, or would some of that begin to change as there were more resources available to the uninsured to be able to access healthcare? So we were looking at what was our role and how that would be changing.
Great, thank you very much. So it's interesting. What I heard was, someone wanted to move beyond direct service. Another organization wanted to really engage in community. Another funder really was looking at it in a strategic way and how to build on work that had been done previously in a strategic plan and really engage in community. So thank you for that. How did you get started? What are some of the first steps that you took after you realized that this might be a focus area that you were interested in? Heather, you mentioned a little bit about starting with mini grants, but then what happened after that? What were some of the early engagements that you had once you had a plan together or had a thought about how you wanted to get started? Heather, do you want to start with?
Sure. Well, and I'll say, Robin, you make it sound like it was very organized. And in fact, it was very emergent, I guess is the best way to describe it. And we were feeling our way into the work. So we didn't start out with a grand plan. I think we had some hunches that we wanted to follow in terms of our work with the community. After attending some of the broader, funder convenings and national conversations about the census, we wanted to have an understanding of how our community perceived the census. And so we did host a few community conversations to understand what were some of the barriers, also conversations with the nonprofit organizations to understand what resources, tools, and support would they need to engage residents in the census. And so we really started by listening and understanding and hearing directly from our community, and that kind of shaped our pathway forward. The mini grants, I think we developed because we didn't want to ask our grantee partners or nonprofit partners to do one more thing on top of the many things that they already have to do. And so to have the staff time set aside for hosting a conversation about the census, we wanted to make sure that they had the funding available for that. So again, that came out of that listening to the nonprofits and hearing about what they needed in order to move forward.
Great, thanks so much. And Carol, what were some of the first steps once you sort of had this built into a plan or built on work that had been done? Where did you start?
So we decided to focus almost exclusively on issues about which there's local jurisdiction. We realized that there are plenty of national and state policies that impact the health in Williamsburg, but the foundation service area, the staff resources really suggested that local policy focus was the most appropriate for us. So we looked at existing policies in Williamsburg, the comprehensive land use plans of the 3 localities we serve, any policies that were already in place that address health, policies relating to transportation and nutrition, community health needs assessments conducted by the local health systems. And we also studied policies in other localities to see if there was anything that might be a good fit for Williamsburg. We studied local health related data. We met with local government staff and advocacy organizations and our own staff. And in 2019, we funded the Virginia Health Catalyst organization, sort of getting our toes in the water in collaboration with about 7 or 8 other health legacy foundations across the state to support a grassroots coordinator position that would lobby for the inclusion of those oral health benefits in Medicaid. And it was a very exciting first win for us to be able to sort of hold up to our board, look, this is what we help support, and they were very successful. And in 2020, we developed a foundation-specific policy on advocacy that outlined the definition of advocacy, how to determine our priorities in alignment with our strategic plan, and the exclusion of lobbying activities. We also in 2020 reorganized our board committee structure to create an external affairs committee, which has board level oversight for our advocacy work and communications. And then finally in 2020, in conjunction with the policy development that we did, we pursued our newest strategic planning process and included in that a specific goal dedicated to advancing systems and public policy crucial to community health. And that new strategic plan was initiated this January of 2021.
Great. There were, a couple of, I think, really key items that came up in all of these discussions. First, it made me laugh, Heather, when you said, this was emergent and you had some hunches. I actually think that's how it works in a lot of places, right? You get this slow hunch that there's something happening and you start to move on and learn more about it, just like Carol was talking about and Natisha talked about, learning what was happening with other policies in the community, et cetera, which organizations were involved. And then you learned over time. When I worked at RWJ, we used to talk about having slow hunches and acting on some of those slow hunches that you have and seeing whether or not they bear fruit. And so I think it is a natural evolution that many organizations have of getting involved in some of these strategies and activities. So that was great. Thank you. I thought it was interesting, Carol, too, that you raised the issue of sort of talking to your board and, setting up a different committee there. How did your board get engaged in discussions about policy and advocacy? What opportunities or concerns did they raise? And how did you work to address or, sort of do education?
So really in 2021, really this year, we began a series of board education sessions that were conducted by Boulder Advocacy, nonpartisan group of the Alliance for Justice. And each session took place immediately prior to our quarterly board meetings. So we had sort of a captured audience of the board. They were there for board meetings. We took 45 minutes to an hour before their full meeting started to have these educational sessions. And Boulder Advocacy started with Advocacy 101, legal tips, things that they can and can't do as a foundation. And then the second session talked about investing for change, how to fund advocacy. And then the third session ended with advocacy and community organizing, evaluation and capacity building. Prior to those trainings that we had set up by Boulder, we really found that some board members expressed real concerns about the foundation's reputation, wanted to make sure that we weren't being perceived as lobbying. And once they understood the difference between lobbying and advocating and the do's and don'ts that foundations can follow, there were really very few concerns identified after that. It was really a great opportunity for them to get a better perspective on what our role could be as advocates.
Great. I think the education is really critical for everyone, for board members, for staff, for community members. It's really critical to understand what it is that can and can't be done, what foundations can and can't fund, what other funders can be engaged with. So sounds like a great way to start. So Natisha, you have a role as Director of Community Partnerships, which are a lot of the things talked about in this publication in terms of getting started. What conversations did you and the staff engage in to think about and talk about getting involved in policy and advocacy and the need for that? And how did you work with other staff in the foundation to start to implement some of the plans that you had?
That's a great question. And something that you wrote in your report stuck out to me. You wrote, in the end, relationships develop at the speed of trust. And I had to take that into account as I got started. It's just building trust and having staff and the outside community understand what the foundation is trying to do by implementing this role and focusing on advocacy and policy. And so I just took some time to build relationships with the staff and our grantees and our donors, our funders, and all of the stakeholders that are involved in our work. Just trying to understand what the needs were in the community and how we could address those. And so within the community engagement team, we first looked at what we fund. And so we saw that about 11% of our funding for our community impact grants were already going to advocacy and systems level work. And so we tried to analyze where that funding was going, what the impact was, and how we could amplify that impact by continuing to work with these individuals and increasing our funding into policy, advocacy, and systems level works. And so this work continues to evolve. And that's something that I really enjoy about the work that I do, is because it does evolve based on what's happening out here in our community. And I also say one of the big things that addresses our work or affects our work is what happens in the General Assembly. And so with me coming on board in December 2020, that was right before the General Assembly of 2021. And so I had the opportunity to look at what are some of the policies that are coming in place that can affect our community, and how can we support or continue to come alongside the policies that are in place to support our community based on some of the changes that are coming in place. And so our team continues to have those conversations to determine where our work should evolve, where our work should go, and what we should do and how we should continue to involve the community.
Natisha, I love the title of your role too, Director of Community Partnerships, which I think is a great position, especially in a community foundation, of course, but really in any community, to have someone whose role is to really build those partnerships and relationships and to learn from community and bring it back and engage. So I think it's a terrific role. I'm curious about what the response has been from the community for many of you. Do they know you're involved in policy and advocacy advocacy work? What response have you heard from anyone, from elected officials, from your board, from stakeholders, from partners? Heather, in your census work, what have you heard? Because you've been pretty intentional about sort of engagement of community. So what have you heard back from them?
Well, first of all, I think our grantee partners appreciated the financial support that went along with the, resources that we provided in terms of information about the census, hosting, public sessions with, an expert from the census and so on, talking about the opportunity and why it was important. So I think it's kind of that combination of providing the financial support and the resources we heard from our grantee partners was really helpful to them. I think as part of our journey, we began with the census, but that led us into other advocating on other issues. And most recently this summer, we were very active in advocating in terms of the prioritization of the American Rescue Plan funds for the city of Alexandria to be dedicated to those communities that were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And that advocacy around the use of the ARPA funding, specifically targeting BIPOC communities around economic opportunity, rental assistance, and so on. We've heard from community members and nonprofit organizations that both our leadership, again, and the resources that we provided were essential. And then also, talking directly with city council members, the mayor, members of city government, they appreciate it, I think. They know we're not jumping in on every issue. And so when we are lending our voice and we are reaching out to them about something that we think is critical, I think that carries some weight. And so they did want to hear from us when they were on the eve of making some pretty significant decisions about resources for the city. So overall, I think it's been extremely positive.
Great. Thank you. Carol, you talked about meeting with elected officials as you were introducing your strategic plan, et cetera. So what has the response been from them or from other stakeholders in the community?
Well, thank you, Robin. This really has been our first year of implementing a clearly defined advocacy plan. And that has entailed me meeting with each elected official in all three of the jurisdictions that we serve. Those meetings have focused on sharing our new strategic plan, providing an opportunity for that elected official to share any of their thoughts, their concerns, ideas, or issues that are important to them that they want us to be aware of. We also held a breakfast with our local senators and House delegates for our region. Once again, sharing our strategic plan, making ourselves and our convening capabilities available to them, our meeting space available to them. And then they shared some concerns that they had, and we had a very valuable discussion, I think partly because there was no ask in the room, which is unusual for them. Usually when they meet with people, someone has an ask of them to please do this or please do that. And we intentionally put no ask in the room with them so that they could feel free to talk to us about issues or concerns or thoughts that they had, to think about ways in which we could possibly assist them. We said, if there is an issue that you want more information from the public about, we are happy to convene on behalf of you to get a focus group together to get ideas and thoughts that might help inform your thinking. And then we also held, unfortunately due to the pandemic, a virtual breakfast with the senior leaders of each of our localities. We sent bagels to their offices and fruit and so forth. So we sort of had breakfast with them. To get to know them and for them to get to know us. Once again, we had shared with them our strategic plan. We offered them our space, our convening capabilities, and to potentially commission research on issues or areas of interest, which were multi-jurisdictional in particular, that aligned with our strategic plan. So we weren't going to cherry pick something for this jurisdiction or that jurisdiction, but really something that would affect all three jurisdictions that they might want some research or more information about. So we and all of those meetings were very well received, and it was a great opportunity for us to build relationships with them.
Yeah, it's great. I've heard actually from all three of you on the panel about building those relationships early with no ask in the beginning, and then really once you have the personal connection, being able to move to next steps. So Natisha, I'm curious from your perspective, since your role is community partnerships, what have you heard back from, those initial round of conversations you have after you join the community, but then since then, as you've gotten more engaged?
So initially, when I was talking to different individuals, everyone was really ecstatic and excited about the foundation moving into this direction. And they were actually kind of doubtful that we would ever get to that point. And so for us to be here and be able to support the work that the community is doing has been really helpful, and it makes my job easier. And so I'll say that again, that continues. And because of that work and those initial conversations, I've been able to implement some strategies into the work here. And so, for example, I will be launching a literacy coalition that for the first time will have parents and on the committee, on the coalition. And so we'll be implementing community voice, not just parents that are typically involved in that work, but we'll have Spanish-speaking parents. And so I'll have the first bilingual coalition as part of the foundation's work. So I'm really excited about that. And also continuing to ensure that we're educating our leaders that are in the community. And I appreciate you allowing me to my event on Thursday. And so we'll be launching a nonprofit advocacy coalition or cohort after this Thursday, because this Thursday I'll be having a virtual session on everyday nonprofit advocacy, and I'll drop that link in the chat a little later. But that will be the springboard for a cohort of smaller nonprofits that are working in advocacy and policy work to get together so we can amplify their voice and ensure that the work that they're doing is seen and heard in the community, and so that we're making sure that those system level changes that we want to see happen even sooner, because we're involving more individuals and more organizations. And so I'll say that, it's been really good to see the impacts and the response from the community about the work that we're doing in advocacy and policy work.
That's great. I'm so glad. I was actually going to call on you later, Natisha, to mention your Thursday session. So thank you for putting in a plug in. Please do drop it in the chat before we leave. That is also one of the things that I heard from other funders as well, is that bringing people together at the middle or grassroots sort of level was really important, because often advocates may not be getting together in other venues. And so bringing them together so that they can learn from each other and you can be part of the conversations and be hearing from them about what's important is, I think, a really great strategy. So thanks for mentioning, and good luck with your panel on Thursday. Hope all goes well. So I'm curious about how each of you have addressed opportunity and equity in your work, since policy and advocacy is often used to sort of provide opportunity for all. It's tools to have greater impact, to be able to make social change in some way. All of our organizations are about a mission of trying to make the world better. So how have you addressed this issue of equity and opportunity in your work? And what's the reaction been from any stakeholders that you're working with? You can just jump in, or I can call on you, but go ahead and jump in. Natisha.
I'll just go ahead and say we've been making an effort to reach out to organizations that may not be aware of us, or who are not typically who we would have a relationship with, to ensure that we're addressing that. And we also we have a organization here in the region called the African American Nonprofit Leaders Group. And so we have constant conversations with them to see how we can do better to support the Black and Brown executive directors that are in our region doing the work here in our area. And so again, making that effort to reach out across the community to determine who needs assistance, who isn't typically in our portfolio, and who is doing the work in the community that needs to be lifted up, and so that people can be aware of what's happening.
Great, thank you.
I'll just add that I feel like our focus and our commitment on racial equity is what has been driving our foray into advocacy. I think without that as a guiding light, I don't know that we would be doing the advocacy work. And our advocacy is specifically has been focused on ensuring that the communities that have actually been most harmed by systems due to systemic racism and institutional racism, that they have a voice in reshaping those systems. And so that's why for the American Rescue Plan funding and the community conversations that the city of Alexandria was hosting, we were really passionate about making sure that communities that have typically not been at the table were at the table, so that their voice was equal to the business community and the more affluent communities in the city. And so I think that's a real place where philanthropy can play a role. Is it wasn't just us being the ones who were saying, you know, this is what the city needs to do, but how do we make sure that community member voices were amplified and that they were engaging and had the opportunity to connect directly with city council makers and city council members and decision makers, so that they, again, would be at the table.
Great, thanks, Heather. Carol, how do you address opportunity and equity in your work?
So we, as we talked about earlier, the idea of health in all policy, we really have been trying to intercede in areas where we feel like we can have an influence on how health incorporates into the policy work that's being done. I'm currently sitting on an affordable housing task force for the city of Williamsburg. And part of the reason why I'm sitting on that task force is because we recognize, as part of those social determinants of health, that housing has a huge impact on people's ability to gain health and maintain a healthy status in their life. It's difficult to do if they're living under a bridge somewhere. So we are very focused on where we can help infuse the ideas of health into all policies and how those policies affect everyone in that work.
Great, thank you. I know I heard from some funders in various parts of the state that they don't necessarily use equity as a term, the language, but they talk about opportunity and lifting up opportunities for all. So that's part of what resonates in your community, but important to engage in the work, knowing you know, what's important and what you want to focus on and make change about. So I'm curious for all panelists, have you encountered any downsides? Some of you mentioned that you haven't gotten a lot of pushback or, you know, whatever, but have there been any downsides to being involved in policy and advocacy? And if the answer is no, that's fine too. But I'd be curious if there are, because this question certainly did come up in some of the conversations I had.
So I would say, go ahead.
Go ahead, Carol.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I can't say that we've directly encountered any, you know, major downsides to the work that we're doing, but we're keenly aware that that's possible. I think if we were doing this exact same thing 5 years ago, we would have raised eyebrows both on our board and in the community. But things have shifted. I think people are more open to advocacy as we're currently doing it. But we may not have taken a position on anything that would be considered highly controversial at this point in time. And we may never do so. I think there's always a challenge around having the staff bandwidth to be thoughtful and effective as we ventured into this arena. And I don't think you can ever really say that our foundation is ultimately responsible for X policy change or Y development of a particular, you know, local land use of some sort or another. Foundations like to know that what their impact is and how to measure it, but I think sometimes with advocacy, you have to let go of that a little bit instead and work to be part of something that will eventually have impact. You know, we say we want to be the angel on the shoulder of those in power to consider, you know, their decisions. I think one potential downside is that advocacy tends to focus on big issues. And if you fund along those big issues, it can mean big dollars. Housing, transportation, food deserts, early childhood, all of that can get very expensive. So if you want to be a good strategic partner, you just need to be thinking about that and realize that in order to incent change, it can be expensive. And so you need to start small and figure out from there where you want to go.
Great, thanks, Carol. Heather, did you have a thought you wanted to?
Yeah, well, and actually Carol, I think, touched upon some of the, I wouldn't say downsides, but just challenges and some of the things that we learned through our, first steps into advocacy. One is that it does take some specialized expertise. And so we had to figure out how to acquire that and bring that in, whether it was working with consultants or different advisors. And so I think that has been key. And then I do think there's a different, I want to say either pace or cyclical nature to a lot of advocacy work. It can be very reactionary. And so you kind of have to, when something is moving legislatively, you kind of have to be prepared and ready to respond. And that's not always on the timeline that you have planned or that you would want. And so I think that can be challenging when you have, organizations that do have limited resources. So I think that's just something to be aware of. And I think I appreciate Carol's point too about measurement and knowing, if you're having an impact. And I saw that was one of the questions in the chat. I think for us, obviously, did the legislation pass, yes or no, is always something that we're paying attention to. But it's less about how we contributed to that. It's more about like, what are we learning from our work in that? And how can we use what we're learning to improve our work and improve the work that we're doing with our grantees?
Great, thank you. And I actually, thanks for lifting up the point that was made about measuring impact. I think that's always a question when you're involved in policy and advocacy, because if you only measure impact by what laws get passed or don't pass, it's going to be hard, because sometimes that takes decades or longer to affect a change. There's a great vignette in the publication about getting the dental benefit added to Medicaid in Virginia. And, that was a 10-year campaign, I heard. So, you would have had a long time to wait until you saw a change on that. However, each year there were measures of progress and things developed over time, and looking at some of those indicators, milestones along the way, what kind of capacity is there in the community, what advocates are involved, are key partners engaged in this issue, are there coalitions who are interested in the state, are people talking about the issue in the state, in social media and other kinds of communications, and of course, are decision makers aware and interested in these issues. So there's a lot of sort of intermediate ways to take a look at policy change too. So Natisha, curious from you if you have any additional thoughts about downsides, or if you want to talk about the issue of measurement. And I know you're relatively new to the foundation, but how you might think about doing that in the future.
I just concur with Carol and Heather, just looking at the pace and understanding the perspective of all the stakeholders involved. So yes, I do want to have community voice involved in what I do, but we also have to think about where does the board feel like our direction should go, and what do we want to get involved with. And so I know that one of the biggest things for me is I wanted to hit the ground running and get involved in a lot of things, but I needed to make sure that my pace matched the temperature of the board and the staff and what the foundation wanted to put forth publicly. And so just making sure that that work aligns with the strategies and what we have going on as a full foundation, and not just in my role. And then as far as measurement of outcomes, we're still trying to figure that out. Like Heather, again, just like Heather and Carol said, we can't take credit for what happens at the state level or at the local government level, but we can look at how many individuals are we supporting through advocacy and policy and systems level work with our grant making? How many individuals are partaking in the educational opportunities that we present as far as advocacy policy and getting involved in that work? And so right now it's some simple measurements that we take, and we're trying to figure out exactly where that sweet spot is with those measurements. And luckily we have a great staff member on our team who looks at just specifically data, who's helping me work through that information. And we hope to have some more solid measurement outcomes as my role progresses.
Natisha, I am so delighted that you just mentioned the word data, because I think that's also really important to be able to know, sort of what not only the stats are in your community, but to use data, whether research or understanding of how people feel, public sentiment about something, being able to really take a look at the numbers to help inform policy and help inform advocacy activities that funders get involved with. So thank you for lifting
Definitely.
that. Really important. So we're going to open up the floor now to question and answer. We've had some in the chat so far, and I just want to encourage others to put your questions in here. First of all, we had a call out. Thank you so much, Debbie, for the plug for Virginia Public Access Project. For those of you who are not familiar with VPAP, it is unique to Virginia, and it provides amazing information to help you understand what's happening at the state and local level. You can sign up for a daily briefing that comes out every morning. I actually, as soon as I turn the computer on in the morning, I read Virginia news from VPAP to find out what's happening around the state, and I find it a wonderful resource. So it really is terrific. And maybe we can put, and maybe someone already did put the link in the chat if you're not familiar with it, and you can get the daily briefing as well. They sum up sort of headlines from different newsletters around the state. So you may only be reading the newsletters in your part of the state, but you can get sort of a summary across the state, and they have lots of other wonderful data resources as well. And I think Patty mentioned that he is going to be one of the 2 speakers at our pre-General Assembly session in January. So you'll be hearing more from David Poole, who's the executive director. Let's go to questions. Aside from the question about how do you measure success, we had a call out for emergent thinking and learning over time about how to do the work. But there's also a question about the right sizing evaluation impact across the time horizon. Any thoughts about what foundations can do beyond funding to support policy and advocacy network building? Any of you panelists want to comment on that? I know you fund some organizations, but beyond funding, what are the ways you think you have influence, and how do you support network building in your area? Heather, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think some of it is the basic convening. So bringing folks together and providing access to experts or other resources that will help our grantees and grantee partners kind of become more informed, understand the issues, learn what they can do. So there's, I think, that opportunity for technical assistance and capacity building. I also think there's what we can do is to help amplify the voices and the messages of, again, the communities that we're working in partnership with. So whether that's through our social media, making sure or that we're amplifying their voices, or letting elected officials know if we have relationships with them, that they should be, talking to, this group or that leader, and so on. So I think there's different ways that we can use our influence to amplify the voices of others.
I would agree. I think that foundations have a fair amount of reputational capital that can really influence in their local areas in particular. There's a lot of policy change that can take place without necessarily government action to make that happen. For example, we've done a fair amount of work in the areas of nutrition improvement and transportation. And a lot of that has happened through our direct contacts with our local agencies, both private and public, and the work associated with that. And I think too, taking time to develop those relationships with your local officials, again, both public and private, to work on common areas of interest. I think once you have those relationships built, you've begun to earn the right to be heard and to share your thoughts and why you think something's important, why your foundation focuses on particular areas of your strategic plan and how that's driving your work, and where that can be done in conjunction with some of the local officials that you're interacting with.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Albert, thank you for your questions and I'm very appreciative. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and just mention this other resource that you mentioned about the Virginia Mercury.
I don't think it was me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Hey, it was Allison Brody.
Allison. Well, thank you both for your comments. Allison, please go ahead.
So, I mean, are people familiar? You may already be familiar with the Virginia Mercury. It's part of States Newsroom, which is an organization that supports nonprofit reporting in capital cities. And I love it. I find that the articles are in depth, they're on relevant topics, and it's free. So, you know, they hope you will donate and things like that. But I think it's a great resource. I really, really do. And I encourage you, and I encourage our nonprofits to read it too, grantees and others. And really, I'm not, they don't employ me or anything. I just think it's a great resource. It has some of that in-depth reporting that we just don't see and can't see in a lot of our local papers because they don't have the staff anymore. So.
Such a good point about, unfortunately, local papers going away, and where do you get information that is local and specific to your community? So thank you. Thanks to all of you for sharing that resource. So I'm aware of the time, and I also want to encourage others to raise questions and so that we can have some more conversation about it. But I do want to ask the panelists for some advice from each of them. So what if you were talking to other funders in the state like you are now, but if you were giving them advice for funders who may just be starting to think about policy and advocacy, maybe haven't really done that much before, what would you advise them to do about how to think about it, how to get started, what's worked for you? The floor is open. What advice do you have? Do this, don't do this.
So I'll take a stab at that, I guess. So as we've already talked about up to this point, really, I would say educate your board first. You never want to get out ahead of your board. So certainly make sure that they understand where you're going and what you're trying to accomplish, so that they do understand that there is a difference between advocacy and lobbying. I think they need to learn that difference first. I would say look at your data. You know, where are you an outlier compared to other communities like yours, and focus on those things. And don't be intimidated, you know, and start with small, modest goals. Consider your objectives, your focal points, and take time to develop an advocacy plan that will help guide what you want to do. And when we wrote that first advocacy plan, we brought that to our external affairs committee of our board so that they knew exactly where we were going, what we were going to be focusing on, where we were going to be spending our energy, and the 3 agencies that we wanted to fund their general operations work for this first year of really initiating this strategic plan that included advocacy. So I think, you know, all of those pieces coming together have really allowed us to, you know, move the ball forward a little bit at a time in this process.
Great. Natisha, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
I agree with Carol. Just start small. Start with something that's related to your current strategy. And again, you have to bring along your stakeholders. That's your board, that's your staff, that's your donors, your funders, and just ensuring that everyone is aligned and on the same page about the direction that you're taking. And again, make sure that you're getting that community voice, because that's who we're doing the work for, are the individuals in the community. And as Heather mentioned earlier, just ensuring that we are addressing and including the people who have been who are dealing with the systemic issues that we're trying to address, making sure we're including them and including their voice in the process, because they have the knowledge about how we can best address these situations.
Great, thank you. Heather.
Yeah, just to echo what Carol and Natisha said, starting small, and that was how we started with the census. I think our approach was a little bit different than what Carol shared. Like, we didn't start with the training of our board. That's something we plan to do next year. We didn't have a kind of master advocacy plan. That's something that we're working towards, to be more intentional about how advocacy fits into our strategy. But we just got started. We identified an issue that was critical to our community, engaged our key stakeholders, primarily our grantees and community members, in helping us shape what we do, and kind of learn from there. So I would say, don't be intimidated. Just pick an issue that, or identify an issue that is important to your community, and play to your strengths. Also, if you if you don't have a communications team, we don't have a communications team, then maybe you're not going to start out with the op-ed writing and that sort of thing. Start with where you're strong, and then consider ways to really tap into the strengths that exist within your grantee partners.
Great, thank you. I just want to, in wrapping up, just lift up what I just heard from all of the panelists, which is starting small, but to the quote that I shared at the end of the presentation, start where you are. Wherever that is, it's a good place to start, and take a first step. And maybe the first step is learning more yourself, not doing anything per se, but educating yourself, meeting elected officials, finding out what policies there are in your community and issues that you care about if you don't already know what those are. Checking out some other resources in the state. And I do hope the publication is useful to you, to link you in to some of the great resources we have both here in Virginia as well as other states that can be helpful to you as a funder. There are things that some foundations can't legally do, and some foundations are able to do some things that others aren't. So of course you want to know that about what is possible for you to do. So learning about that is a good first step. We do hope next year, through the Virginia Funders Network, to be offering more educational sessions about some of these various topics, including what funders can and can't do and how to start getting engaged. And so we hope that you'll join us for those sessions as well. And we, as always, are interested in hearing what it is that funders and members in Virginia are interested in terms of policy and advocacy and how they do their work. So I hope you'll share with all of us at the Virginia Funders Network what's working for you, what you're doing. And I personally can be helpful to any of you. I'm delighted to do that. So I am going to turn this back over to Katie Moore, the CEO, in a minute. But before I do that, I'd love to ask everyone on this call to join me in thanking three terrific panelists today: Natisha Knight, Heather Peeler, and Carol Sale. I thought you were a great panel and really lifted up some of the nuances and the richness of what you've learned along the way. And it's always so valuable to learn that from others. So thank you so much for taking the time and sharing what you know. I want to reiterate from what Katie mentioned earlier. I'm so appreciative to the Funders Network, but particularly to Richmond Memorial Health Foundation and PATH Foundation for funding this position and effort within Virginia Funders Network. So thanks to both of you for that. And I'm looking forward to doing more good things together next year. So thank you very much. And I'll turn this back over to Katie.
Thanks, Robin, so much. This was a great session. And also I want to acknowledge the fact that this was the culmination of 6+ months worth of work. Robin interviewed over 100 folks, over 80 interviews. And this was really a heavy lift. Robin, thank you so much for everything that you've done for VFN. And if you haven't downloaded the report yet, please do that. I put the link here in the chat. It's also under the publications tab on our website. The appendices alone are worth the download because it is basically an outline of almost all of the policy and advocacy and community organizing groups across the Commonwealth. It's really the who's who. So thank you, Robin, and thanks to our panelists. I want to just highlight a couple of other upcoming events. There's only a handful more VFN events the rest of the year. October 28th is our next Social Justice Funders networking group. We're going to be talking about trust-based philanthropy and exploring how funders are really implementing that in their work. We have our second in our broadband learning series on November 3rd. And this will really be a panel of funders who are already investing in broadband, not only in the state, but also in states across the country. So this will be a nice modeling of what's possible in investments in broadband and how broadband is a very complex topic and it feels expensive, as you can imagine. But with very small, relatively small investments, you can make pretty big impacts in your community. So that's a great session to join us for. And then November 17th, we're having our very first virtual business meeting and 1-year anniversary celebration. I hope everybody will join us for that. Very exciting. And if you register by this Friday, we're going to send you a small gift just to mark our 1-year anniversary. And then just a preview of what's to come for next year, since this was about policy and advocacy. We are already pulling together our pre and post General Assembly legislative updates for our members. As we mentioned, David Poole is going to be there from VPAP. We also have someone from the Commonwealth Institute lined up for that. So you'll be hearing more about that in the coming weeks, but we hope everyone will save the date, the afternoon of January 6th. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Big thanks to the VFN team, Patty Koval, who's behind the scenes, all the technical assistants. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And we will see you guys all again real soon. Thanks.